I woke up to the smell of antiseptic and something cold pressed against my arm before I understood where I was. The light above me was too bright a harsh white that made my eyes sting when I tried to open them. A steady beeping sound pulsed somewhere near my head, slow and patient, like it was keeping time for a body that did not quite belong to me yet. My mouth was dry. My tongue felt thick. When I tried to move, pain exploded behind my eyes and ran down the back of my neck, sharp and disorienting. I closed my eyes again and breathed through it because that was what I had always done when things hurt. A nurse leaned into my line of vision, her voice calm and practiced as she told me my name and asked if I knew where I was. It took me a few seconds to answer. "Emergency room," I said, finally, my voice hoarse and unfamiliar. She nodded, satisfied, and told me I had been brought in unconscious the night before. Christmas Day. The word landed heavier than the pain. Christmas. I tried to sit up, but my body resisted my head spinning as if the room itself had tilted. The nurse gently pressed me back down and told me to take it slow. She explained that I had suffered a concussion and significant head trauma, that I had been dehydrated and unresponsive when the paramedics arrived. Paramedics. The memory should have come with that word, but my mind stayed blank, a dark stretch of missing time that made my stomach tighten with unease. A social worker entered the room shortly after introducing herself with a soft smile and pulling a chair closer to my bed. She spoke carefully, asking questions that felt both routine and deeply personal. Did I feel safe at home? Had anyone hurt me? Was there someone I trusted that she could call? I answered automatically at first out of habit, but my words felt thin even to my own ears. Safe was a word I had learned to redefine over the years, stretching it until it fit situations it never should have. The social worker listened without interrupting, then glanced at her notes and told me they had tried to reach my emergency contact the night before. "My mother," she said. "Diane Cole." She told me the exact time the call had gone through. 9:18 in the evening. She paused, then added quietly that my mother had answered and hung up. The room felt suddenly smaller. I stared at the ceiling at the faint crack running across one of the tiles, trying to understand what she had just said. Hung up. No one had come. No one had called back. The nurse confirmed it when she returned, her expression gentle but firm. They had tried multiple numbers. No one had shown up. I asked for my phone, then my hands trembling as I took it from the tray beside my bed. There were no missed calls from my family. No messages asking where I was or if I was okay. My notifications were quiet, empty in a way that felt intentional. I opened Facebook without thinking, my thumb moving on instinct. The first thing that appeared was a photo of my family at the country club, all of them dressed in festive colors, wine glasses raised, smiling wide for the camera. "Merry Christmas," the caption read. "So grateful for family and togetherness." The timestamp was from the night before, right around the time I had been lying unconscious on a living room floor. I scrolled further, each image another small betrayal. My mother laughing. Tyler with his arm around her, red-faced and cheerful. Ron standing behind them, his hand resting casually on a chair like nothing in the world had gone wrong. The room began to spin again, not from pain this time, but from the realization settling into my chest. They knew where I was. They had been told, and they had chosen to stay where they were. I pressed my phone to my chest, my fingers curling around it as if it could anchor me to something solid. The social worker asked if I wanted to talk about what had happened before I lost consciousness. I opened my mouth, then closed it again. Words felt dangerous. Saying them out loud would make them real in a way I was not ready for. Instead, I whispered that I was tired. She nodded understanding and told me she would be back later. When the room was quiet again, I stared at the ceiling and let the truth settle fully for the first time. I had not been forgotten in the chaos of a holiday. I had not been missed because no one noticed I was gone. I had been ignored. My family had looked at a choice between responsibility and comfort, and they had picked comfort without hesitation. The pain in my head throbbed in time with the monitor, but beneath it was something deeper and colder. A clarity I could not push away. Christmas morning in the emergency room was silent, except for the machines, and for the first time in my life, I understood that silence was not an accident. I was alone because they had decided I should be. From the outside, my family looked exactly like the kind of people everyone trusted. The Coles were the kind of family neighbors pointed to when they talked about values and tradition. We attended the same church every Sunday, always sitting 3 rows from the front. My mother Diane dressed in soft colors and polite smiles, my stepfather Ron nodding solemnly during sermons, my brother Tyler shaking hands with anyone who looked important enough to remember. At Christmas, we were visible everywhere that mattered: the charity auction at the country club, the holiday toy drive photo op, the candlelight service where my mother cried on cue during Silent Night. People knew our names. They knew our faces. They thought they knew our story. Diane worked hard to make sure of that. She believed image was protection. If enough people believed you were good, then nothing you did behind closed doors could ever fully touch you. Growing up, I learned quickly that appearances were not optional. They were mandatory. The house had to look perfect when guests arrived, even if the night before had ended with slammed doors and raised voices. We cleaned for company, but never for comfort. Diane liked to say that family business stayed in the family, but what she meant was that truth stayed hidden. Ron rarely contradicted her. He believed silence was the same as peace, and if he stayed quiet long enough, conflict would burn itself out. Tyler learned a different lesson. He learned that as long as he played his role well in public, he could do almost anything in private. The charming son, the golden boy, the one with potential everyone kept talking about. I was the reliable one, the helper, the glue. At Christmas, that dynamic became sharper, more dangerous. The holidays were Diane's stage. Every detail mattered because every detail was part of the story she told the world. Matching pajamas for photos, coordinated decorations, the annual country club dinner that proved we belonged there. She talked endlessly about gratitude, about how blessed we were, about how important it was to appreciate family. But gratitude in our house flowed in one direction. I learned early that my role was to make sure everything ran smoothly so that Diane could enjoy the applause. If something went wrong, it was because I had failed to anticipate it. If Tyler drank too much or lost his temper, it was because I had said something wrong or pushed him too far. Ron would sigh and tell me not to make things worse. Always me, always behind the scenes. The public version of my family was so convincing that I sometimes wondered if I was the one imagining the cracks. People complimented Diane on raising such a close family. They praised Tyler's charm and Ron's quiet strength. They told me how lucky I was, and for a long time I believed them, or at least I tried to. Christmas reinforced that lie every year. Diane would remind us how important it was to look united. We were a team, she said. Teams did not argue in front of others. Teams did not embarrass each other. Teams protected their own image at all costs. What she never said out loud was that some members of the team were expendable, that some people existed to absorb stress so others could shine. As long as the pictures looked good, nothing else mattered. That belief shaped everything. It explained why problems were dismissed instead of addressed, why apologies never came, why Tyler's behavior was always minimized. Boys will be boys, Diane liked to say, smiling as if it were a joke. Ron would look away, and I would learn to adjust to accommodate to keep the peace so the image stayed intact. Christmas amplified that pressure. Diane wanted perfection because perfection reflected back on her. The tree had to be full. The gifts had to look generous. The dinner plans had to impress. She loved telling people how hard she worked for her family, even though most of that work happened in conversations, not actions. I handled logistics. I paid bills. I smoothed conflicts. I made sure Tyler had what he needed so he would not explode at the wrong time. In public, Diane was the heart of the family. In private, she was the gatekeeper of approval. Affection was conditional. Praise was rare. Criticism was constant and often disguised as concern. She worried about my tone, my attitude, my tendency to overreact. Ron backed her by saying nothing. Tyler backed her by taking advantage. The image they presented worked because people wanted to believe it. A respectable family at Christmas is comforting. It reassures others that the world makes sense, that bad things happen elsewhere to other people. No one wants to imagine that the smiling woman at the country club dinner could hang up on a hospital calling about her daughter. No one wants to imagine that the laughing sun could be dangerous when no one is watching. And because no one wants to imagine it, families like mine survive on that disbelief. Lying in the emergency room staring at photos of my family celebrating without me, I finally saw how deliberate it all was. The image was not just a mask, it was a weapon. It kept people from asking questions. It kept me from asking them too. Christmas was never about love in my family. It was about proof. Proof that we were fine. Proof that Diane was a good mother. Proof that Tyler was a good son. Proof that Ron was a good husband. And I was proof that everything worked because I made it work. Until the night it didn't. And when the image and reality finally collided, they chose the image without hesitation. I did not become the system overnight. It happened gradually, so slowly that by the time I noticed, it already felt permanent. When I was 22 and fresh out of school, I moved back home because it made sense financially. That was how it started. Just until I got on my feet. Just until I found something stable. Diane framed it as a blessing, telling everyone how grateful she was that I cared so much about family. Ron nodded approvingly. Tyler barely noticed, except that suddenly there was one more person available to solve his problems. At first, my contributions were small, covering a utility bill when Diane forgot. Handling paperwork Ron did not want to deal with, helping Tyler with gas money when he was between jobs again. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself this was what responsible adults did. The praise came quickly. Diane called me reliable. Ron said I had a good head on my shoulders. Tyler said I was the only one who really understood him. That approval felt warm at first. It felt like belonging. Then it became routine. And then it became expectation. By the time I turned 25, my paycheck no longer felt like mine. It moved through the household like a shared resource allocated based on who was loudest or most urgent. I paid the electric bill because Tyler needed his internet. I covered insurance gaps because Ron forgot to renew. I transferred money to Diane because something unexpected had come up. There was always something unexpected. I started managing logistics because no one else would. Filing taxes, scheduling repairs, tracking due dates. The more competent I proved myself to be, the more invisible my effort became. When things went right, no one noticed. When something went wrong, I was asked why I had not prevented it. Pride shifted into obligation without my consent. I remember the moment it crossed a line. I was 27, exhausted from working overtime, when Diane handed me a stack of envelopes and asked me to sort them because she was overwhelmed. As I flipped through them, I realized they were past due notices. Not one or two. Many. Bills that had been ignored for months. I felt panic, then sharp and immediate, because I knew what would happen if they were not handled. Tyler would rage. Diane would cry. Ron would retreat. And I would be blamed for not stepping in sooner. So I did. I paid them. I did not ask permission. I did not ask for repayment. I just solved the problem. That night, Diane hugged me and told me she did not know what she would do without me. The words should have felt comforting. Instead, they felt like a sentence. From then on, everything flowed through me. Money, information, decisions. I became the buffer between Tyler and consequences, between Diane and reality, between Ron and conflict. I smoothed over mistakes before they could surface. I anticipated needs before they were voiced. I learned to read moods the way other people read weather reports. Emotional undulation became my daily rhythm. A moment of satisfaction when something was resolved. A dip into exhaustion when I realized there would be something else tomorrow. A brief sense of purpose followed by resentment I immediately buried because resentment was dangerous. Resentment threatened the image, and threatening the image was the one thing you were never allowed to do. Tyler learned quickly that if he needed something, he could come to me. He framed his requests as dreams, plans, opportunities. He just needed support. Diane framed them as family obligations. Ron framed them as keeping the peace. I framed them as manageable because if I did not, everything would collapse. I told myself I was strong, that I could handle it, that other people had it worse. But strength without boundaries is not strength. It is slow erosion. I stopped asking what I wanted. I stopped imagining a future that did not include fixing someone else's mess. Holidays became projects. Christmas became an operation. Budgeting, scheduling, managing personalities, making sure nothing triggered Tyler, making sure Diane was not embarrassed, making sure Ron stayed neutral. I functioned, efficient, quiet, necessary. No one ever sat down and asked me if I was tired. No one ever asked if I needed help. They assumed I would handle it because I always had, and I kept doing it because somewhere deep inside, I believed that if I stopped, I would lose whatever fragile place I had in that family. I was not loved for who I was. I was valued for what I provided. And when your worth is measured by usefulness, you become afraid of rest, afraid of saying no, afraid of failing at the one role you have been allowed to occupy. By the time Christmas arrived that year, I was already running on empty, but I told myself it was fine. I always did, because acknowledging the truth would have meant admitting something far more frightening. They did not need help. They needed someone they could drain. Christmas in our house was never gentle. It arrived the way a storm does, slowly at first, then all at once, tightening the air until every breath felt like work. By the first week of December, Diane's expectations filled every room. She talked constantly about schedules, appearances, who would see us, and what they would think. The holidays were not about rest or reflection. They were about performance. I could feel the pressure building long before Christmas Day itself, a low hum of anxiety that followed me from room to room. Tyler started drinking earlier as the month went on, just a beer at first, then something stronger by mid-afternoon. Diane noticed, but pretended not to. Ron noticed and said nothing. I noticed everything. I learned to watch Tyler's eyes, his posture, the way his jaw tightened when something irritated him. I adjusted my tone. I softened my words. I made myself smaller to keep the peace. That was my role. Christmas amplified every flaw in our family because it demanded closeness without healing. We were expected to gather to smile, to celebrate together without addressing the damage that lived between us. Diane insisted that Christmas be perfect because perfection distracted from everything else. She planned the dinner weeks in advance, choosing dishes that looked impressive rather than ones people actually enjoyed. She talked about the country club party like it was an honor we had to earn, reminding us repeatedly that not everyone was invited. I knew what that meant. No mistakes, no scenes, no embarrassment. Tyler resented those rules. He hated being controlled, but he also hated being excluded. That contradiction made him volatile. The more Diane tightened her grip on the image, the more Tyler pushed back in private. I found myself mediating conversations before they could turn into arguments. I handled last-minute changes. I paid for missing items. I absorbed complaints. Emotional undulation became constant. A spike of stress when Diane criticized something I had already fixed. A brief relief when Tyler laughed instead of snapped. A sinking feeling when Ron withdrew further into silence. I told myself I was managing it. I told myself this was normal. Christmas morning arrived cold and gray. I woke early, my body already tired, my chest tight with anticipation. Diane moved through the house issuing instructions, her voice sharp and cheerful at the same time. Tyler complained about the food. Ron asked where his jacket was. I handled all of it, one task bleeding into the next. I did not sit down. I did not eat. I did not pause long enough to notice how unsteady I felt. Tyler started drinking before noon. Diane pretended it was festive. Ron pretended it was none of his business. I pretended it was manageable. By early afternoon, the tension was visible. Tyler's movements were sloppy. His jokes edged toward cruelty. Diane snapped at me for small things, her smile slipping when she thought no one was watching. Ron stayed out of the way. I felt like a wire pulled too tight, vibrating under invisible strain. Christmas had become a pressure cooker, and I was the lid holding it closed. I knew something was wrong. I could feel it in my body, in the way my hands shook slightly when I poured drinks, in the way my head throbbed behind my eyes. But I ignored it. I always did, because acknowledging danger meant confronting reality, and reality was not something our family tolerated well. Diane kept reminding us of the schedule. When we needed to leave, who we would see, what we would wear. Tyler bristled at her tone, responding with sarcasm that barely concealed his anger. Each exchange tightened the air further. I stepped in when I could, redirecting conversations, offering solutions, trying to keep everything moving forward. Forward was safer than stopping. Stopping meant thinking. Thinking meant realizing how trapped I felt. By late afternoon, the house felt charged like static before a lightning strike. Tyler was drunk enough that his volume increased, his patience evaporated. Diane was frantic, her need for control intensifying as she sensed things slipping. Ron retreated completely, and I stood in the middle of it, exhausted, hungry, emotionally spent, still telling myself I could handle it. Christmas was supposed to be about peace, but in our house, it was about endurance. Who could tolerate the most without breaking? Who could absorb the most tension without reacting? I had been winning that contest for years, but every win cost me something. That day, I felt it clearly. The cost had become too high. The pressure was no longer contained. Something was going to give. I did not know yet that it would be me. The moment everything shifted did not look dramatic at first. There was no shouting, no slammed doors, no raised voices drawing attention. It happened quietly, the way the most dangerous moments often do. We were in the living room, coats half on, Christmas music playing too loudly from a speaker. Diane insisted set the mood. Tyler sat on the edge of the couch, glass in hand, his face flushed, his movements loose and unfocused. Diane was pacing, checking her phone, reminding us again how late we already were. Ron stood near the door keys in his hand, eyes distant. I was gathering my bag, already thinking ahead to what still needed to be done, when Tyler looked up at me and said my name in that casual tone he used when he wanted something. I stopped automatically. He told me he needed money. Right now. Not later. Not tomorrow. Right now. He said it like it was obvious, like the request itself required no explanation. I asked him how much, my voice already tight. He named a number that made my stomach drop. It was more than I had expected, more than I was comfortable giving, especially in that moment. I hesitated. That pause was new. For years, I had responded to his requests with immediate solutions. This time, I did not. I told him I could not do it right now. I said we could talk about it later. I said we were about to leave. The room went quiet. Diane froze mid-step and turned toward me slowly, her smile slipping just enough to reveal irritation beneath it. Tyler stared at me, his eyes narrowing, confusion giving way to offense. He asked me why. The question was sharp, accusatory, as if my refusal had already become an insult. I tried to explain calmly. I said I had already covered several expenses that month. I said my account was tight. I said I needed to think. Diane stepped in immediately, her voice low but urgent. She told me not to do this today. She told me not to embarrass the family on Christmas. Her words were soft, but the message was clear. Fix it. Tyler's jaw clenched. He leaned forward, his voice rising. He accused me of always changing, of suddenly acting like I was better than him. He said I was ruining the day. Ron shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. I felt my heart begin to race, adrenaline flooding my system. I tried to de-escalate the way I always had. I told Tyler we could talk after the party. I told him this was not the time. That was when he stood up. His movements were unsteady, but his anger was focused. Diane hissed my name under her breath, a warning, a command. I realized then that this was not about money. It never had been. It was about control. For the first time, I had disrupted the system by saying no. That single word threatened everything they relied on. Tyler stepped closer, invading my space. I could smell the alcohol on his breath. He told me I was selfish. He told me I owed him. He reminded me of everything he had been through, as if his struggles erased my right to boundaries. Diane backed him up instantly, telling me how stressed he had been, how hard things were for him, how this was not the day to make a stand. Ron looked at the floor. I felt something shift inside me, then a mix of fear and anger and something like resolve. I told Tyler again that I was not transferring the money. My voice shook, but I did not take the words back. The air in the room felt electric. Tyler laughed, a sharp, humorless sound. He told me I was making a mistake. Diane told me to stop being dramatic. She said people were waiting. She said I was holding everyone up. The pressure closed in from all sides. Years of conditioning screamed at me to give in, to smooth it over, to sacrifice myself one more time. But my body refused. I felt dizzy, exhausted, overwhelmed. I knew if I caved again, something in me would break permanently. I shook my head. That was all it took. Tyler's expression changed completely, anger hardening into something colder and more dangerous. Diane took a step back, already calculating, already preparing to rewrite whatever happened next. Ron stayed silent. In that moment, I understood the risk of defiance. I had always known it intellectually. Now I felt it physically. The financial trigger was not just about money. It was the spark that exposed how fragile the balance really was. I had said no, and the system that depended on my compliance began to collapse. What happened next unfolded faster than my mind could process, but slower than my body could escape. Tyler did not shout at first. That almost made it worse. His voice dropped tight and controlled the way it always did right before he lost it. He told me I was not listening. He told me I thought I was in charge. He took another step closer, close enough that I instinctively leaned back, my shoulders brushing the edge of the dining table behind me. Diane said his name once sharply, not as a warning, but as a plea for him to calm down before someone else might see. Ron finally looked up, his face pale, his mouth opening slightly as if he might speak. He did not. Tyler's hand gestured wildly as he talked his glass, sloshing liquid spilling onto the rug. He accused me of humiliating him, of making him look weak, of choosing money over family. I tried to respond, to explain, to slow things down, but my words tangled in my throat. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. I remember thinking that I needed to move away from the table, that the edge pressed into my back felt dangerous. I shifted my weight, trying to step to the side, and that was when Tyler shoved me. It was not a punch. It was not dramatic. It was a sudden, forceful push to my shoulder, hard enough to knock the breath out of me and send me stumbling sideways. I hit the corner of the table with my hip pain flashing white and barely caught myself before falling. Diane gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Ron took one step forward, then stopped. Tyler swore under his breath, his anger flaring hotter. He told me to stop getting in his way. The words felt surreal, as if I had become an obstacle instead of a person. I said his name, my voice shaking now, telling him to stop, telling him I did not want to fight. That was when he pushed me again. Harder. This time I did not have time to react. My head snapped back as my feet slipped on the hardwood floor. I remember the sound more than anything else, a dull crack as the back of my head struck the edge of the table. There was a flash of light behind my eyes, blinding and immediate. My knees buckled. I felt myself falling but could not stop it. The room tilted sharply. Diane's face blurring into the ceiling lights, Tyler's expression twisting into something I did not recognize. Then the floor rushed up to meet me. The impact knocked the air from my lungs. Pain exploded across my skull and down my neck, followed by a heavy pressure that made everything feel far away. I heard someone say my name distant and distorted like it was coming from underwater. My vision narrowed. Sounds dulled. I tried to move to say something to let them know I was still there, but my body would not respond. The last thing I remember clearly was staring at the leg of the table, my cheek pressed against the cold floor, wondering why no one was calling for help. Then the darkness closed in. It was not peaceful. It was heavy and sudden, like a door slamming shut. There were no dreams, no thoughts, just nothing. Later, I would learn that I had been unconscious for a significant amount of time, that my breathing had been shallow, that my head injury was serious enough to cause concern. But in that moment, there was only absence. When awareness flickered back briefly, it came in fragments, the sound of hurried voices. Diane saying something about being late. Tyler pacing, Ron urging calm. I felt hands on my arm. Not gentle, pulling me slightly as if checking whether I would wake. I wanted to scream, to tell them I was hurt, that I needed help, but my mouth would not open. My body felt impossibly heavy. Consciousness slipped away again deeper this time. When I did not wake up, they made a decision. Not to call for an ambulance. Not to stay with me. Not to sit and wait and see if I would regain consciousness. They decided the party mattered more. Later, I would replay that moment over and over, wondering if there had been a point when someone could have chosen differently, if Ron could have stepped in, if Diane could have put Image aside, if Tyler could have backed away. But in that room on that day, the pattern held. My pain was an inconvenience. My unconscious body was a problem to manage, not a person to protect. And so they left me there. I do not remember this moment they decided to leave, but I know how it happened because I have replayed it 1,000 times in my head, piecing it together from fragments from later discoveries, from what the evidence quietly revealed. After the impact, after my body went still on the floor, there was a brief window where something else could have happened. Someone could have knelt beside me. Someone could have checked my breathing properly. Someone could have picked up a phone and dialed 3 numbers that would have changed everything. Instead, the room shifted into a different mode, the familiar one my family always entered when reality threatened the image. Damage control. Diane was the first to recover her composure. She always was. Panic flickered across her face, but it did not last. Panic was messy. Panic drew attention. She crouched near me long enough to call my name, to shake my shoulder slightly. Then she stood and looked at Ron with that sharp, assessing glance I had seen my entire life. The glance that asked one silent question. How bad is this going to look? Ron hovered nearby, hands half raised, torn between concern and habit. He asked if I was breathing. Diane told him not to touch me too much, that they did not know what they were doing. Tyler paced, swearing, running his hands through his hair, already framing himself as the victim of the situation. He said he had not meant it. He said I should not have pushed him. He said this was getting blown out of proportion. Diane told him to lower his voice. She reminded him they were late. The country club reservation, the people expecting them, the story already in motion. They waited. Not long enough to see if I would wake up on my own, long enough to convince themselves that I probably would. When I did not move, when my breathing stayed shallow and uneven, the tension in the room thickened. That was when the choice became clear. Diane said we cannot deal with this right now. Ron hesitated. He asked again if they should call someone. Diane snapped that an ambulance would cause questions. Tyler scoffed and said I was always dramatic, that I would be fine. No one knelt beside me again. No one checked my pupils. No one thought about the cold floor beneath my cheek or the angle of my neck. They thought about appearances. Diane grabbed her coat. She told Ron to get the door. She told Tyler to clean up the spilled drink. I lay there unconscious as they moved around me, stepping carefully, avoiding my body the way you avoid furniture in the dark. Someone covered me with a throw blanket, not out of care, but out of discomfort, as if hiding me might make the problem disappear. The front door opened. Cold air rushed in. Diane paused, looking back once her expression tight, calculating. She said we will deal with this later. Ron nodded. Tyler muttered something about not missing the first course. And then they left. The door closed behind them with a final sound I would later recognize from the Ring camera footage. A clean, unmistakable click as the lock turned. They locked the door, not to protect me, to protect themselves, to ensure no one wandered in, to ensure the image stayed intact. The house went quiet. Christmas lights blinked softly in the corner. Music still played from the speaker, cheerful and oblivious. I lay alone on the floor, my body slowly losing heat, my brain injured, my breathing shallow. Time passed. How much time I cannot say. Minutes. Maybe longer. Enough for damage to deepen. Enough for risk to increase. Enough for the decision they made to become irreversible. At some point, a notification appeared on Diane's phone at the country club. A missed call from the hospital later. She ignored it. Or she answered and hung up. The exact sequence mattered less than the outcome. They did not turn around. They did not leave the party. They did not come back. The Ring camera captured them leaving. 3 figures stepping out into the winter evening, coats adjusted, smiles practiced. The timestamp would later align perfectly with my medical records. A quiet departure that sealed what happened next. Inside the house, I remained where I had fallen. No one checked on me. No one sat with me. No one realized that the line between unconscious and not waking up again can be dangerously thin. When people talk about abandonment, they imagine chaos or cruelty. What happened to me was quieter than that. It was efficiency, a problem postponed, a choice rationalized. They told themselves I would wake up. They told themselves I was fine. They told themselves it was not their fault. And because they believed that, they allowed themselves to enjoy Christmas dinner while their daughter lay injured on the floor. The house stayed locked. The lights stayed on. The image stayed intact. And the cost of that choice rested entirely on me. I did not wake up because my family came back. I did not wake up because someone panicked and called for help. I woke up because a woman who barely knew me noticed something was wrong. Her name was Elaine Porter, and until that night, she was just the quiet neighbor who lived 2 houses down and waved politely when our paths crossed. She was walking her dog that evening, bundled in a thick coat against the cold, when she noticed our front porch light was still on long after we had supposedly left for the party. At first, she thought nothing of it, but as she passed again later, the light was still on. The house was silent, no car in the driveway. Christmas music faintly audible through the door. Something about it unsettled her. She stood there for a moment listening, feeling that uncomfortable pull people get when their instincts tell them to pay attention. She knocked once. No answer. She knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. She tried the doorbell, then peered through the window beside the door. She could not see much, just shadows and the glow of lights reflecting off the hardwood floor. What she did see made her stomach drop. A shape on the floor. A body that was not moving. She did not hesitate after that. She called 911 immediately, her voice tight but steady, as she explained that she believed someone inside the house was hurt. The dispatcher told her to stay on the line and asked if the door was locked. It was. Elaine rattled the handle once more, then stepped back, panic setting in as she realized how long whoever was inside might have been lying there. Sirens arrived quickly, cutting through the quiet neighborhood with urgency that felt jarring against the peaceful holiday decorations lining the street. Paramedics moved fast, professional, and focused, forcing the door and rushing inside with equipment in hand. Elaine stood on the sidewalk, hugging her coat around herself, watching as flashing lights painted the houses red and blue. Inside, they found me exactly where I had fallen. Unconscious. Cold. Breathing shallowly. One of the paramedics knelt beside me and checked my pulse while another shone a light into my eyes. They spoke in clipped phrases that would later appear in the report. Head trauma. Possible concussion. Unresponsive. Time unknown. As they lifted me onto the stretcher, Elaine heard one of them say that it was lucky someone noticed. Lucky. The word followed me all the way to the hospital. The ride was a blur of motion and sound, the hum of the ambulance, the pressure of straps across my chest, the sting of oxygen against my face. I drifted in and out, consciousness flickering like a weak signal. At one point, I heard a voice ask if anyone was with me. Another voice answered, no. At the hospital, the lights were blinding the air sharp with disinfectant. Doctors and nurses moved around me with purpose, calling out vitals, starting IVs, stabilizing my neck. Someone asked again about family. Someone else said they would call the emergency contact listed. They did. The time was logged, 9:18 in the evening. Diane answered, and then she hung up. When no one came, the staff did what they were trained to do. They treated me. They documented everything. The bruising, the swelling, the head injury, the dehydration, the fact that I had been unconscious for an extended period of time, the fact that no one had been with me, the fact that a neighbor had called 911. By the time I was stable enough to be moved to a bed, Christmas night had passed. Elaine went home shaken but relieved that she had acted. She would later tell police that something about the house did not feel right, that she could not explain it, but she knew she could not walk away. That instinct saved my life. When I woke up hours later in the emergency room, I did not know her name. I did not know what she had done. I only knew that I was alive and alone. It would take time for the details to come together, for the timeline to be reconstructed, for the contrast to settle in. A stranger had noticed. A stranger had acted. A stranger had cared enough to make a phone call that my own family had avoided. The weight of that realization would hit me later harder than any physical pain. But even in those first moments as I lay under hospital lights listening to the steady beep of a monitor, some part of me understood a truth I could no longer ignore. The people who saved me were not the ones who shared my last name. The first thing I noticed after the pain settled into something manageable was the absence. Not silence, because the emergency room was never silent, but the absence of voices that belonged to me. No familiar footsteps, no worried whispers, no one asking if I was awake yet. Nurses came and went, efficient and kind, adjusting monitors and checking vitals, but every time the curtain shifted, I felt a small irrational hope rise in my chest, and every time it fell flat. Hours passed like that. I drifted in and out of sleep, my head aching dully, my neck stiff and sore, my arms marked with bruises that darkened as the night went on. At one point, a nurse asked if anyone was coming to sit with me. I shook my head. She nodded in that careful way people do when they already know the answer but need confirmation. Later, the social worker returned, pulling her chair close again, her expression more serious now. She explained that they had attempted to reach my emergency contacts several times, that they had left messages, that no one had arrived. She asked if there was anyone else she should call. I gave her my Aunt Marilyn's name, my voice quiet and uncertain because it felt strange to reach outside the system I had spent my life protecting. As she stepped out to make the call, I stared at the wall and felt something inside me sink lower than it ever had before. This was not an oversight. This was a choice. When morning came, Christmas decorations still hung in the hallway outside my room, a paper wreath taped to a door, a sign wishing staff a happy holiday. It felt surreal, like the world had moved on without noticing what had happened to me. Nurses brought me water and crackers. A doctor explained my injuries in calm, measured terms. Concussion, head trauma, observation required. He asked if I felt safe returning home. The question hung between us. I hesitated too long. He noticed. He made a note. The social worker returned again, her tone gentle but firm now. She explained domestic safety screening her words, careful practiced. She asked about my family dynamics, about alcohol, about what had happened before I lost consciousness. I found myself minimizing automatically the way I always had. She did not push, but her eyes told me she was listening beyond my words. She told me that the absence of family support was concerning, that it was documented, that it mattered. Hearing that shook me more than I expected. For years, I had absorbed neglect as normal. Now, someone was labeling it what it was. Later that morning, I checked my phone again. There were missed calls, voicemails, all from my family. Not frantic, not panicked. Diane's message was clipped, her tone annoyed rather than worried. She said she heard I was at the hospital and wanted to know what happened. Tyler left a rambling message that veered between irritation and defensiveness. Ron left none. None of them asked if I was okay. None of them said they were coming. None of them apologized. I listened to the messages once, then set the phone down, my hands shaking. The emotional drop hit hard then. A deep, hollow realization that this was not a misunderstanding that could be fixed with explanation. They knew. They simply did not care enough to show up. Nurses continued their rounds. Shift changes happened. Faces changed. The question stayed the same. Is someone coming? The answer stayed no. By early afternoon, the social worker sat with me again and explained that given the circumstances, she would be making a report, that my case raised concerns of neglect and possible abuse. Her words were careful, but the meaning was clear. What happened to me was not invisible. It was being seen. That frightened me and relieved me at the same time. I felt exposed, like a secret I had protected for years was finally being pulled into the light. At the same time, a strange sense of validation settled in. I was not imagining things. I was not too sensitive. Something was wrong, and it had been wrong for a long time. When Marilyn finally arrived later that day, her face pale and drawn, she looked around the room and then back at me, her eyes filling with tears. She asked where everyone else was. I shook my head. She sat down and took my hand, squeezing it tightly as if grounding both of us. That was the first human touch that felt safe since I had woken up. Until then, I had been alone, truly alone. No one had come when it mattered. No one had sat beside my bed through the worst of it. No one had chosen me over convenience or comfort or image. As the reality settled in, something inside me shifted. I stopped reaching for excuses on their behalf. I stopped telling myself they were busy or confused or doing their best. They had been informed. They had been given the chance to show up, and they had declined. The emotional drop was steep and unforgiving, but it brought clarity with it. For the first time, I allowed myself to see the situation without the filter of loyalty, and what I saw was abandonment, plain and undeniable. The voicemails did not arrive all at once. They trickled in over the course of the day, each one carrying a different tone but the same absence of concern. I listened to them alone in the hospital bed, the curtain half drawn, the hum of the hallway filtering in as background noise. Diane's message came first. Her voice was controlled, slightly irritated, the way it always sounded when something disrupted her plans. She said she had heard I was at the hospital and wanted to know what happened. She reminded me that it was Christmas and that people were waiting on them at the club. She said we would talk later and ended the call without asking how I felt. I stared at the phone after it went quiet, my thumb hovering over the screen, waiting for something else to come through. Tyler called next. His message was longer, slurred, in places defensive throughout. He said he did not mean for things to get out of hand. He said I should not have pushed him. He said people were making a big deal out of nothing. At one point, he laughed as if trying to lighten the mood and said I always landed on my feet anyway. He asked if I could still help him out with some money because he was in a tight spot. I felt sick listening to it, the way his concern curved immediately back toward his needs. Ron never called. That absence spoke louder than any message could have. As the hours passed, more voicemails arrived. Diane, again this time sharper, asking why I had not responded. She warned me not to let outsiders get involved. She said family matters should stay private. She said people were talking. Tyler again oscillating between anger and self-pity, blaming stress, blaming alcohol, blaming me for escalating things. None of them asked if I was in pain. None of them asked what the doctors had said. None of them said they were on their way. I listened to every message once, forcing myself to absorb them fully. For years, I had filtered their words, translating them into something kinder than they were. I had told myself Diane worried in her own way, that Tyler did not know how to express concern, that Ron showed care through silence. Lying there with my head throbbing and my body sore, those translations no longer worked. The words were what they were: practical, self-centered, detached. A nurse came in to check my vitals while I was replaying one of the messages, and she noticed my expression. She asked quietly if everything was okay. I nodded out of habit, then stopped. I shook my head instead. She did not ask for details. She just stayed for a moment longer than necessary, adjusting my blanket, making sure my water was within reach. That small kindness landed harder than the voicemails ever could. Later, the social worker returned and asked if my family had been in contact. I handed her my phone. She listened to one message, then another, her expression tightening with each one. She did not comment immediately. When she finally spoke, her voice was careful. She said she was concerned about the content of the messages. She said the focus on money and image, rather than my well-being, was significant. She said this pattern mattered. Hearing a professional say that out loud shifted something inside me. It reframed the experience in a way I could not undo. These were not awkward attempts at connection. They were evidence. The emotional impact hit me in waves. First, anger, hot and sharp, directed at Tyler for his entitlement. Then, disappointment, heavy and familiar, aimed at Diane for choosing control over care. Then, grief, quiet and aching for the version of family I had spent years hoping might exist. I cried without making a sound, tears slipping down the sides of my face as I stared at the ceiling. No one rushed in to stop me. No one told me to calm down. The space allowed the truth to settle fully. When Marilyn came back later, she asked if I had heard from them. I nodded and told her what they said. She listened, her jaw tightening, her hand squeezing mine. She told me that none of it was okay. She told me that I deserved better. Those words felt strange, almost foreign, but they also felt right. That night, after the lights dimmed and the hallway quieted, I played the messages one last time. Not to hurt myself, but to understand, to see the pattern clearly. Their concern started where my usefulness ended. That realization did not break me the way I thought it might. It steadied me. It gave shape to something I had sensed for years, but never named. I set my phone face down on the tray and closed my eyes. For the first time since waking up in the emergency room, I felt a sense of resolve forming beneath the pain. If they were not coming, then I would stop waiting. If they were not worried about my survival, then I would start prioritizing it myself. The voicemails were not an attempt to connect. They were a final confirmation. Marilyn arrived quietly the way people do when they are bracing themselves for bad news. I noticed her before she spoke because the room felt different when she stepped inside, steadier, like something solid had finally entered the space. She was my mother's older sister, 58 years old with tired eyes and a posture shaped by years of carrying responsibility without applause. She looked at me first, then at the monitors, then back at me again, as if she needed to confirm that I was real and breathing. She sat down slowly and took my hand in both of hers, her grip warm and firm. For a moment, neither of us spoke. She did not rush to fill the silence. That alone felt like care. When she finally asked what happened, her voice was low and direct. I told her what I could remember, choosing my words carefully out of old habit. She listened without interrupting, her expression tightening as the story unfolded. When I reached the part where I said my family had gone to the country club, she let out a short breath through her nose. Not surprise. Recognition. She told me she had seen them there. Diane laughing Tyler, drinking Ron, standing off to the side. She said they talked about me as if I were an inconvenience, saying I had caused a scene and then disappeared. She said Diane rolled her eyes and called me dramatic. Hearing it confirmed from someone else felt like a door closing. Marilyn did not soften it. She did not try to protect my feelings. She told me the truth because she believed I could handle it. She said she confronted Diane in the restroom later that night, asking where I was and why no one had checked on me. Diane brushed her off, saying I was fine and that I always exaggerated. Marilyn said she knew then that something was very wrong. She told me she went home uneasy and checked her phone later, seeing the missed call from the hospital. When she realized what had happened, she called immediately and drove straight there. I watched her face as she spoke, seeing anger flash beneath her controlled exterior. She told me she had tried to reason with Diane for years. She had warned her about enabling Tyler. She had pointed out how much I carried. Diane never listened. Marilyn said she was done pretending this was normal. The words settled over me like a blanket. Done pretending. That was what I had never allowed myself to say. Marilyn leaned closer and told me I needed to leave that house. Not for a while, not until things cooled down, permanently. She said I was not safe there. She said family loyalty did not require self-destruction. I felt a familiar instinct rise in me, the urge to defend, to explain, to minimize. Marilyn saw it and shook her head gently. She told me she had spent years watching this pattern repeat. Diane controlling, Tyler exploding, Ron disappearing, me absorbing. She said the night I was injured was not an accident. It was an escalation that everyone but me had been expecting. Hearing that stung, but it also clarified something. I had been the only one pretending this was temporary. Marilyn told me she would help me find a place to stay. She told me she would support whatever steps I needed to take. She told me she would speak to authorities if necessary and tell them what she knew. That last part frightened me. Speaking out felt dangerous. But it also felt inevitable. Marilyn squeezed my hand again and told me that silence had protected everyone but me. She said the system only worked because I kept feeding it. If I stopped, it would collapse. The idea terrified me. It also felt like relief. A nurse entered to check on me and Marilyn stayed quiet, her presence steady. After the nurse left, Marilyn asked if I wanted her to listen to the voicemails. I hesitated, then handed her my phone. She listened to them one by one, her jaw tightening further with each message. When she finished, she set the phone down carefully and looked at me. She told me plainly that none of it was acceptable. She said that if a friend treated me that way, I would walk away. Family did not get a free pass to cause harm. Those words landed with weight. They challenged something deeply ingrained in me. Marilyn stayed for hours long after visiting time technically ended. She talked about practical things, housing, work, therapy. She did not make promises she could not keep. She did not dramatize. She spoke calmly, clearly, like someone who had already decided which side she was on. When she finally stood to leave, she told me she would be back the next day. She told me I was not alone. As the door closed behind her, I felt a strange mix of exhaustion and strength. For the first time since waking up, someone had spoken the truth out loud and stood by it. An ally had named what was happening, and once it was named, it could not be undone. The idea that paperwork could protect me felt strange at first. For most of my life, documents had been another burden I carried for everyone else. Bills, statements, forms no one wanted to read. But lying in that hospital bed listening to Marilyn explain what needed to happen next, I began to understand that paper did not lie the way people did. Paper remembered. Paper told the story without emotion, without excuses, without fear. When I was discharged a few days later, still dizzy and sore, Marilyn took me to her house instead of home. The quiet there felt unnatural at first. No tension humming beneath the walls. No one watching my reactions. Just space. The first night I slept for almost 12 hours. The next morning, with my head still aching and my neck stiff, I opened my laptop. I told myself I was just checking things. That was how it always started. But as I logged into my bank accounts, a familiar dread settled in my chest. Transactions appeared that I did not recognize. Withdrawals I had not made. Charges I had not approved. At first, I tried to explain them away. Maybe I had forgotten. Maybe it was a mistake. Then I checked dates, times, patterns. The truth became harder to ignore. Money had been moving out of my accounts regularly, sometimes in small amounts, sometimes larger, always framed as something urgent or temporary when it was mentioned at all. I pulled up older statements going back months, then years. The scope of it unfolded slowly, painfully. I saw transfers tied to Tyler, payments connected to Diane, insurance policies in my name that benefited someone else. I felt sick, not just from betrayal, but from recognition. I had allowed this by not looking too closely. I had trusted. That trust had been exploited. Marilyn sat with me as I organized everything into folders, dates, amounts, notes. We worked quietly, methodically, turning chaos into order. Every entry told a small part of a larger story. By the time we finished, my hands were shaking. Not from fear this time, but from anger. This was not family help. This was financial abuse. Marilyn encouraged me to take the next step. We filed an identity theft report with the Federal Trade Commission. Filling out the form felt surreal, like I was admitting to a crime I had never wanted to name. I described what I had discovered, attaching documentation checking boxes that felt too heavy for their simple language. When I clicked submit, something shifted. It was no longer just my word against theirs. It was recorded. Then came the credit freeze. Equifax, Experian, TransUnion. One by one, I locked down my credit answering security questions, creating passwords, reclaiming control. Each confirmation email felt like a small victory, a barrier where there had been none. I updated my employer, explaining that there had been unauthorized activity connected to my accounts. They were supportive, professional, reassuring me that my job was secure. That support contrasted sharply with my family's response. Diane called that afternoon, her tone sharp and suspicious. She asked why she was suddenly unable to access certain accounts. She accused me of overreacting. She said I was making things difficult. I told her calmly that I was protecting myself. She scoffed and said I was being dramatic again. I ended the call. That was new. Ending the call without explaining, without apologizing, without fixing anything. Tyler left angry messages demanding to know why his card stopped working. He said I was ruining his life. He said I owed him. Ron sent a brief text asking if everything was okay, as if nothing had happened. I did not respond. The paper trail spoke louder than any argument could. Marilyn helped me make copies of everything, both digital and physical. We created a timeline that aligned with my medical records with the night of the assault with the missed calls from the hospital. It was all connected. Neglect, violence, financial exploitation. A pattern that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. I felt exposed, vulnerable, but also grounded. For the first time, I had proof, not just of what they had done, but of how long it had been happening. That knowledge was heavy, but it was also clarifying. It stripped away the last remnants of doubt. I was not imagining things. I was not exaggerating. I had been systematically drained financially and emotionally until there was nothing left to take but my safety. When I closed my laptop that evening, my head throbbing from concentration, I felt a strange sense of calm. The paper trail existed now. It could not be erased by denial or rewritten by image management. It was real, and it would matter. The first meeting with the attorney did not feel dramatic. There was no courtroom, no raised voices, no gavel striking wood. It took place in a quiet office with neutral walls and a pot of burnt coffee sitting on a side table. That normalcy made everything feel heavier. This was not a story anymore. It was a case. The attorney listened carefully as Marilyn and I explained what had happened, taking notes without interrupting. When I handed over the documents, the medical records, the bank statements, the screenshots, she flipped through them slowly, her expression growing more serious with each page. She asked clear, direct questions about the assault, about the timeline, about the phone calls from the hospital, about the financial activity. When I told her about the Ring doorbell footage showing my family leaving the house while I lay unconscious inside, she paused and looked up. That mattered, she said. That changed things. She explained that based on what we had, we could file for an emergency protective order, that it would create immediate legal boundaries and document the threat. The word emergency made my chest tighten, but I nodded. The paperwork was filed the same day. I signed forms with a hand that shook only slightly, my name suddenly carrying weight I had never allowed it to have before. Within hours, the order was granted. Tyler was prohibited from contacting me. Diane and Ron were formally notified. The law had stepped into a space I had protected for too long. Word traveled faster than I expected. In our neighborhood, information moved quietly but efficiently, especially when safety was involved. Elaine's 911 call had already raised questions. The flashing lights on Christmas night had been noticed. Then someone posted on Nextdoor. Not details, just concern. A message about police activity on our street and a neighbor being taken to the hospital. Comments followed. Hope she is okay. That sounds serious. Does anyone know what happened? The speculation made my stomach churn, but it also cracked the image my family had relied on. Diane called repeatedly after being served the order, her messages shifting from anger to panic. She warned me about ruining reputations. She accused me of betrayal. She said I was airing dirty laundry. I did not respond. Tyler, despite the order, went live on social media late one night, clearly intoxicated. His words spilled out unchecked. He complained about being treated unfairly. He said I should not have pushed him. He laughed about how sensitive I was. He ended the stream abruptly when someone commented about assault charges. That video was saved by more than one person. The attorney was pleased when I showed it to her. Admission mattered. Context mattered. Public behavior mattered. Ron attempted a different approach. He sent a carefully worded message asking to meet, saying he wanted to smooth things over. The attorney advised me not to engage. Silence was no longer weakness, it was strategy. Police followed up within days. They reviewed the medical report, the witness statement from Elaine, the ring footage, Tyler's own words online. They asked me to recount what I remembered recording my statement carefully. This time, I did not minimize. I did not soften. I told the truth plainly. When they asked why no one had called for help, I answered honestly, because they did not want to deal with it. That answer seemed to settle something. The investigation expanded. Diane and Ron were questioned about failure to render aid. They deflected, denied, reframed. The evidence did not bend. In the community, whispers grew louder. Diane stopped attending certain events. Invitations dried up. The image cracked under the weight of reality. People noticed absence the way they had once noticed presence. At the grocery store, a neighbor asked Marilyn how I was doing. Genuine concern in her voice. That mattered more than I expected. The collision between law and public perception was messy and uncomfortable, but it was real. For years, my family had operated on the assumption that no one would look too closely. Now, people were looking. The legal process moved forward methodically, indifferent to image. It did not care how perfect Christmas photos looked. It cared about timelines, injuries, decisions made and not made. Each step reinforced a truth I had resisted. Accountability does not arrive quietly. It disrupts, it exposes. And once it begins, it does not stop just because someone is uncomfortable. I felt fear, yes, but I also felt something steadier beneath it. A sense that the ground had shifted in my favor for the first time. The system I had propped up was gone. In its place stood another system, imperfect but real one, that did not depend on my silence to function. Consequences did not arrive all at once. They unfolded steadily, like a series of doors closing behind my family with no way to reopen them. The first was procedural, almost boring in its efficiency. Police returned with follow-up questions and additional requests for documentation. They already had my medical report detailing the head trauma, the length of unconsciousness, the risk factors that came with delayed treatment. They had Elaine's witness statement describing what she saw through the window and the condition I was in when paramedics arrived. They had the ring footage confirming the timeline showing my family leaving the house and locking the door. And now they had Tyler's recorded statements from social media, his own words admitting he lost control and blaming me for provoking him. That combination mattered. Probable cause was no longer a theory, it was established. An officer called to inform me that Tyler had been taken into custody on an outstanding warrant related to a prior incident combined with the new assault charge. Hearing that did not bring relief the way I expected. It brought a strange quiet, a sense of inevitability. This was not revenge. It was the result of actions finally meeting consequences. Diane reacted predictably. She called Marilyn in tears, her voice shaking with outrage and fear, insisting that this was all being misunderstood. She said Tyler was a good boy. She said I had always exaggerated. She said the police had no right to interfere in family matters. Marilyn listened without arguing, then told her that the matter was no longer private. Diane's tears shifted to anger. She accused me of destroying the family. She said I would regret this. Those threats carried less weight now. The law did not care about guilt trips. Ron's consequences were quieter but no less real. Investigators questioned him about why he had not called for help, why he had allowed Diane to make decisions while I lay unconscious. His answers were vague, inconsistent. He said he thought I would wake up. He said Diane told him not to panic. He said he did not know what to do. The phrase failure to render aid appeared in the paperwork. Seeing it written down felt surreal. It named what had happened with precision. It stripped away excuses. Civil standby was arranged when I returned briefly to collect personal belongings from the house. An officer accompanied Marilyn and me while a tow truck waited outside to remove a vehicle registered in my name that Tyler had been using. Diane stood in the doorway, arms crossed, her face tight with resentment. She said nothing as the keys were handed over. The silence was loud. Tyler's arrest rippled outward. Friends distanced themselves. Invitations stopped coming. People who once praised Diane's devotion avoided eye contact in public. The image she had curated so carefully could not survive police reports and court dates. I watched this from a distance, my body still healing my mind, processing the speed at which everything changed. There was fear in it, yes, but also a sense of rightness. Accountability is destabilizing, especially for people who rely on control. Tyler called from jail once despite the protective order, leaving a message filled with blame and disbelief. The attorney documented it. Another consequence. Diane attempted to spin the story within extended family circles, painting herself as a victim of betrayal. Marilyn corrected the record when necessary calmly with facts. The truth did not need embellishment. It stood on its own. Court proceedings followed procedural and unsentimental. I attended when required, supported by Marilyn, my attorney guiding me through each step. I spoke when asked, answering questions clearly. No minimizing. No excuses. Just facts. The judge reviewed the evidence and made decisions without commentary, the way the system is designed to function. Orders were extended, conditions were set, consequences solidified. I felt the weight of it all settle into place. The family I had protected no longer existed in the way I had imagined. The roles had shifted permanently. Diane lost social standing she could not reclaim. Ron faced scrutiny that forced him to confront his passivity. Tyler faced legal accountability that could not be smoothed over with charm or excuses. And I faced the reality of what survival required. That part was harder than I expected. Letting consequences happen felt unnatural after years of preventing them, but it also felt like breathing fresh air after being underwater too long. When the final paperwork was signed and the immediate crises passed, I returned to Marilyn's house and sat quietly letting the day settle. The consequences were not dramatic in the way stories often portray them. There were no speeches, no triumphant moments. There was only the steady hum of accountability doing its work. And for the first time, the burden of holding everything together was no longer mine. 1 year later, Christmas arrived quietly. There were no schedules taped to the fridge, no urgent texts demanding last-minute fixes, no pressure to perform for an audience that would never see me anyway. I woke up in a small apartment that smelled faintly of coffee and pine from the modest tree I had decorated myself. It was nothing like the house I grew up in, and that was exactly why it felt safe. The walls were bare in places, the furniture mismatched, but every inch of it belonged to me. I moved slowly that morning, still aware of my body in a way I had never been before. The concussion had healed, but the memory of it lived on as a quiet reminder of how fragile things could be. I made breakfast without rushing. Toast eggs, a mug of coffee held between both hands. Outside, the street was calm, decorated with lights that felt gentle rather than performative. No one expected anything from me. That absence of expectation was the greatest gift I had ever received. Therapy had taught me how to sit with silence without filling it. It had taught me that peace does not announce itself. It simply exists when chaos leaves. I spent the morning journaling something my therapist encouraged as a way to ground myself when memories surfaced. They still did, especially around holidays. Certain smells or songs could pull me back to that night, to the floor, to the feeling of being left behind. But the difference now was that I did not run from those memories. I acknowledged them and then reminded myself where I was. Safe, alive, free. Marilyn came by in the afternoon with a small bag of groceries and a smile that reached her eyes. We cooked dinner together, laughing at our mistakes, letting the food be imperfect. There was no need to impress anyone. We ate at the table and talked about ordinary things: work, books, plans for the new year. At one point, she reached across the table and squeezed my hand, not in warning or urgency, but in quiet reassurance. That simple gesture meant more than any grand holiday display ever had. After dinner, I took a walk around the block, the cold air sharp but refreshing. I thought about the year that had passed, about court dates and therapy sessions and hard conversations, about learning how to say no without apology, about rebuilding my finances, my sense of self, my understanding of what family really meant. Consequences had reshaped everything. Tyler was no longer a presence in my life. Diane existed only as a name I no longer responded to. Ron faded into the background of a story I was done telling. There was grief in that, but it was clean grief, honest grief, not the suffocating kind that demands self-sacrifice. I returned home as the sun set, turned on the small string of lights around my window, and sat on the couch with a blanket wrapped around my shoulders. For the first time, Christmas felt like rest instead of endurance. I thought back to the emergency room, to the bright lights and the beeping machines, to the moment I realized no one was coming. That memory no longer held the same power over me. It had become a turning point rather than a wound. Silence had been the space where truth finally reached me. Silence had forced me to listen to what my body and my instincts had been trying to say for years. Silence had not destroyed my family. It had saved my life. As night settled in, I wrote one final entry in my journal for the year. I wrote about boundaries, about safety, about choosing myself without guilt. I wrote about how strength does not always look like endurance. Sometimes it looks like walking away and letting systems fall apart. I closed the notebook and placed it on the shelf, feeling a sense of completion I had never known before. This Christmas was different because I was different. I no longer measured my worth by usefulness or approval. I measured it by peace. Before going to bed, I looked out the window one last time, taking in the quiet street. The soft glow of lights, the ordinary beauty of a night without conflict. I knew the work of healing would continue. Recovery was not a single moment, it was a practice. But I also knew I had crossed a threshold I would never step back over. The girl who lay unconscious on the floor while her family celebrated was gone. In her place stood a woman who understood that survival was not just about living through something. It was about building a life where it could never happen again. If you are watching this, I want to ask you something. Where are you watching from? What time is it where you are right now? And if you were in my place, what would you have done? If this story reached you, I want you to pause for a moment before scrolling away. Stories like this are easy to consume and just as easy to forget, but the truth behind them exists far beyond a screen. Somewhere right now, someone is lying awake, replaying moments they keep minimizing, telling themselves it was not that bad, telling themselves it was just stress or alcohol or family drama. If that sounds familiar, I want you to know you are not weak for surviving it, and you are not dramatic for feeling hurt by it. Silence teaches us many things, but the most important lesson is that your body notices danger long before your mind gives it permission. If you recognized pieces of your own life in this story, pay attention to that reaction. It is not coincidence. It is information. I also want to speak directly to those of you who are watching from a distance who may not relate personally but feel anger or sadness on behalf of someone you love. Please listen to them when they tell you something is wrong. Believe them the first time. Ask questions that center their safety, not the family image. Too often we excuse harmful behavior because it is uncomfortable to confront, because it disrupts gatherings, because it forces us to choose sides. Choosing safety is not betrayal. It is responsibility. If you are watching this and thinking about someone who has gone quiet, who stopped showing up, who changed in ways you could not explain, reach out to them. Do not wait for a crisis to make it obvious. To everyone who has stayed silent out of fear, obligation, or loyalty, I want to say this clearly. You are allowed to choose yourself. You are allowed to say no, even if it upsets people. You are allowed to walk away from environments that harm you, even if they call themselves family. Survival is not selfish. Boundaries are not cruelty. Accountability is not revenge. If you are in a situation where you feel unsafe, please seek help. Talk to a professional. Reach out to a trusted friend. Use local resources designed to protect you. You do not have to prove your pain to deserve support. And if you are watching from a place of stability, use that position to amplify voices like this instead of dismissing them. Share stories that challenge harmful norms. Speak up when someone minimizes abuse. Your voice matters more than you think. Now I want to hear from you. Where are you watching from right now? What time is it where you live? Your location matters because it reminds others they are not alone, that this conversation is happening everywhere, not just in one place. And I want you to answer honestly. If you were in Hannah's place, what would you have done? Would you have stayed silent? Would you have left earlier? Would you have asked for help? There is no right answer, only reflection. Share your thoughts in the comments, not to judge, but to connect. This space exists so we can learn from one another, support one another, and challenge the idea that suffering in silence is normal. If this story resonated with you, consider subscribing so you do not miss future stories that explore survival, accountability, and healing. These stories exist because people like you are willing to listen. Thank you for being here, for staying until the end, and for choosing awareness over comfort.